So, if you're here, you may have already seen the last VOD I'm gonna do on Cry of Fear. If not, the TLDR is that I rage quit at the train segment. Sadly, my issues with the game had already been building for a while, and the train was the metaphorical last straw. I'm gonna parcel this out into 3 specific segments: gameplay, story, and nostalgia. These are what I feel to be the best way to concentrate my issues with the game. Mind you, I can't emphasize enough that the hangups I have are my own. If you still enjoy the game, then by all means keep enjoying it. This is the internet and we're all free to have our own thoughts and opinions. However, this is my video, and I get to choose what to yap about, and it's gonna be me being a salty bitch about a game. We're gonna tackle the gameplay first, as it's what I ended up ultimately having the hardest time with, and that killed the game the fastest for me. It just hasn't aged well. Hell, even for the time it was made, it wasn't great. While I do see the vision of what they were going for, as the game does take heavy inspo from the Silent Hill series, the game itself just can't fill those shoes. From the game erroneously putting me on hard mode, the enemies being health sponges because Simon himself does piddly damage, said enemies also having complete bullshit spawns, Simon controlling like he's the clumsiest ice skater in the world, the game having awful brightness settings, and various other nitpicks that just left playing the game an awful experience for me. How do I know the game put me on hard mode? Because when I looked in the game files, when I was poking around the skill and config files, it had my difficulty set to 3. Going by how health and damage are layered in the skill config file, 2 would have been normal. I was already sick of the enemies at this point, so I said fuck it and up my damage while turning off the damage of almost all the enemies. Almost because it seems some of them have damage listed elsewhere, namely the sumo and spitter enemies continue to do damage. I was okay with that since it meant I wasn't totally invincible and that there would still be some challenge left. Before anyone starts piping up that you ruined the atmosphere. No, I didn't. The game still had a very tense atmosphere the entire time and relied largely on jump scares to startle the player. That part of the game remained intact. All I did was level the field of a game that didn't play fair. Besides, I was basically forced to edit those files since the console commands to cheat are removed in the Steam release of the game. Supposedly, the older version of the game from when it was still a mod versus the standalone product still had those commands, and maybe if I had had that, I'd have a better time with the game, but that's a coulda, woulda, shoulda that I'm just gonna not at this point. Another issue with the gameplay, as mentioned, is the movement. I know I was rather vocal in my displeasure that Simon couldn't platform well in order to move around the maps in earlier parts of the game, but that was quickly beaten out of me. Sure, there were a couple of platforming sections early in the game, but they were easy to get through. The floating bloody pathways and then the train car was just abysmal because I couldn't clearly see where I was meant to go. Add on to that Simon being complete garbage to control, and it makes those sections far more frustrating than they needed to be. There were folks that stopped by the stream, and a couple of them told me that Half-Life controlled a bit differently to the point that it took them a while to get used to Cry of Fear. And that just makes me wonder why you would intentionally break part of the game you're deriving your own game from. However, I haven't played Half-Life, so I may have to play that myself in order to gain perspective on that. My next issue was the seeming lack of direction when it came to the later segments. The beginning of the game was very linear and tightly focused, so you could move forward relatively easily. From what I know to be the middle of the game, it completely loses that focus and left me confused and unsure of where I had to go. I'm not saying they needed to have the infamous yellow paint to lead the way, but they did a better job at the beginning of the game to lead the player the right direction. And this fell off around chapter 3 or 4, and would have benefited from a purposeful blood smear or flickering a bulb to draw the player's eye. Some form of directional language to keep the player going the right way rather than leaving them stuck in the, well, where do I go now, stupor. Like, look here for example. This train car with the foot suitcase didn't have anything to indicate that the door could A, be opened, or B, have anything interesting on that side. The poles got in the way, so I just assumed that there was an invisible wall and couldn't go that way. I had to look it up in a walkthrough that there was a sledgehammer in the other car that I needed to progress. If the bars were removed to leave that space open, along with a bloody trail or a print on the door, that would have been more than enough to indicate I could go that way. And speaking of bloody trails, they literally did that at the start of the game to point out, hey stupid, go through this door! So the fact that that sense of direction got lost is a strange design choice from my perspective. Like the devs themselves got lost in what they were trying to do with the game. To harp on the directionless backtracking a bit more, why not leave yet more bloody smears pointing the way? It would fit the monsters repopulating, as if they were the ones spreading it around. Alternatively, we could tie it into a story note. We're already following the doctor who's leaving a trail of bodies in his wake. Would it be too much of a stretch of the imagination that he'd be leaving blood trails for Simon to follow too? The real version of him is already trying to help guide Simon anyway to begin with. It wouldn't be that much to have a masked version of him doing it, albeit if it's in a more sinister way. I guess you could say that the player being lost would just be an extra layer added on to make us feel Simon's own distress and confusion, but I'd just call it finding a way to cover for the devs' own lack of focus in this area. Even with the street maps, I was struggling to figure out where I was supposed to be going when backtracking. It always felt like they were upside down, and more than once felt like I was supposed to be pointed towards a specific direction that was behind me instead. I know how to read maps, but I sure as hell couldn't read the games. My last complaint is with how the UI functions, and it's just as clunky as the rest of the game. Escape only ever brings up the game menu, so it can't be used to back out of the inventory or any notes the player may be looking at. It's such a small thing, but it was so damn annoying to have to override the muscle memory from other games where the escape key had that functionality. The notes were doubly frustrating because you'd have to find a tiny brown square with a red X that was on a brown and bloody background so the button didn't stand out as much. I understand design isn't everyone's thing, but I still fail to see how anyone could have looked at that and went, yeah, that's good, and just sent it on out. I can forgive a game with janky controls if it has a good enough story. I mean, for fuck's sakes, one of my favorite game series is Legacy of Kain, and it's chock full of jank. Back in the 10s, I remembered liking the story and even feeling sympathetic to Simon's situation. But that was over 10 years ago now, and with more life experience, I can't help but view the game through a more critical eye. My rose-colored goggles for the story cracked on playing through it myself, on top of getting a refresher for another video so that I could be sure of what I'm going to talk about. For a TLDR, the story is as follows. Simon gets hit by a car and goes to rehab. He never had the best mental health to begin with, so the loss of his legs exacerbated his already ongoing depressive episode. Doc Purnell is doing what they can to help Simon, but in his current state, he just can't allow himself to be helped. He feels like he can't trust the doctor despite knowing that they're only trying to help him. From there, the game has 4 main endings we'll concern ourselves with. 3 of the 4 endings, Simon kills without any semblance of remorse for his actions. He takes accountability for them, but never responsibility. If anything, in all the endings, he's proud of the harm he's caused, and in one in particular, only regrets that he couldn't do more. The 4th, good ending, Simon lives and is sent to a mental hospital for life so that he'll no longer be a danger to himself or others. For this ending, we'll only see the immediate aftermath of it, so we don't really get to see him take true responsibility for what he's done and how that's affected people. And I hear some of you tic-tacking away at your keyboards, and I'm gonna ask you to put them away for a hot second. I have a point I'm getting to, just give me a moment. Now, the game initially did a fantastic job of setting up the intrigue for the story. Simon just minding his business, even trying to be helpful to an old man we see begging for help. This makes Simon look like a kind character despite having just talked at length about how bitter and lonely he feels on the train. And then he gets hit by a car. Suddenly, we're waking up in an alley wondering where the hell we are and having to fight for survival against twisted versions of humanity. It becomes clear pretty quickly that this is taking place in some form of Simon's mind, but whether it's a coma or him fighting in the afterlife is up in the air this early in the game. It was a popular motif in the growing creepypasta community and in other horror games at the time, with Cry of Fear seemingly leaning heavily into it. The built-up intrigue in Simon's initial sympathetic facade starts to crack through flashes we get to see of his life, both before and after the accident. He had already suffered from severe depression and anxiety even before losing his legs, even going so far as to seemingly beg his friend to stay with him because he loved her. He already felt alone and isolated, with the crash only worsening his self-loathing to the point he further retreated into himself. Add on to this, Dr. Purnell was constantly pressing Simon for information he wasn't ready to provide, making him even more distrustful of the doctor. I can't even blame Simon for that bit, as there's enough medical trauma stories to make anyone leery of physical or mental health care. I know I have enough of my own stories that this portion is still one of the few parts that remain painfully relatable. Sadly, that's the only relatable part of the story once you start taking a closer look at it. So, what's wrong with it exactly? For one, Simon is an unreliable narrator. Now, this isn't a bad thing necessarily, as it is a well-worn trope in writing. And we see hints of this as we go through the section where we're introduced to his friend Sophie for the rooftop conversation, and another in a flashback after the carcass fight. I still believe the talk they had on the roof is how he wished that conversation would have gone. And judging by the flashback, the real conversation likely ended up leaving their relationship in a much rockier place. Via the rooftop conversation, Simon admits he only became friends with Sophie because he liked her due to her being one of the prettiest girls in school. And this version of their talk has him trying to convey that he's always liked her and was always hoping for something more from the start. The love, care, and affection he desired she could give him if he could have her for himself. Given his own admission of bitterness and loneliness from the start of the game, he likely believed our relationship with her could end that. We see how this truly played out in the flashback. Sophie jumping from the roof to commit suicide was a representation of her killing what she represented to him, an escape from his torment. Given that Carcass is meant to be another representation of Simon, it's almost as if he's close to realizing the truth, but can't or won't grasp the fact that it's his own fault. Granted, Sophie isn't portrayed as being cruel for rebuffing Simon's advances, but the endings in which he kills her come across as equal parts punishment for her choice and selfishness on his. He kills her in retaliation because how dare she not give him what he sought from her? He had protected her all those years and been a close friend. How could she not want to be with him? It's selfish on his part because in killing her, he means to take her with him in 2 of the 3 bad endings. And to me, the blood splatter on the tub is indicative of more than just a gunshot wound, that he had also stabbed her corpse in a fit of anger. To further focus on the endings, that's another issue I have with the story and Simon as a character. He never takes any responsibility for his actions. 3 of the 4 endings he is spiteful and bitter toward the world he feels wronged him, to the point of misplacing his anger and blame of his current state onto the 2 people that even he himself admits wanted to help him the most. While he takes accountability for the crimes he commits, he never shows remorse. In killing himself, he removes his ability to take responsibility for them and his mental state, offloading the emotional labor of his well-being unfairly onto those around him. The only deaths in which he shows any genuine remorse for are for the officers that came to his apartment. Dr. Purnell, or likely even Sophie, may have called asking them to perform a wellness check, only for them to be gunned down during Simon's momentary lapse into psychosis. I find it interesting that the officers are the only one that Simon feels any remorse for having killed, even owning that he killed them after his psychotic episode fades. Maybe he felt they didn't deserve it since they're ultimately strangers and thus innocent in terms of those that have caused him harm. He's charged for their murders, and with Dr. Purnell's testimony, he gets a lesser sentence to life in a mental institution. The thing is, we never see him improve past this point. But what about the ending? It says he's doing better, doesn't it? Some of you might be asking. And I ask you to direct your attention to what Simon says about it. Remember, he's been an unreliable narrator before. He was with Sophie, and while I relate to his distrust of the doctor, we see he was the same way with Doc Purnell. Why would the ending be any different? Simon explicitly states that he wrote a good ending for himself in his journal, and it would be a good way to end off his diary. This mention of a good ending comes right before he talks about his life in the mental hospital. To me, this implies that he knows what actually improving and getting better would entail. He writes about how grateful he is for the doctor and his mentorship, for Sophie and her visits, and seemingly accepts that she may be seeing someone new given the tone of the writing, and that he even accepts what he's become now. Maybe I'm just being too cynical, but it genuinely comes across to me that he's recognizing what true responsibility to himself and others would be, i.e. getting better, but is unable to commit to that. While he might still feel genuine remorse for killing the cops, he's still a bitter person. He recognizes what him being better could look like, but isn't able to bring himself there yet. The only thing he can do is write it out as a dream for what he could be. The endings don't paint Simon in a favorable light for me, to the point that I'd even call him a bad person. Note, though, that I'm not saying that he's a bad character. as there is a distinction to be made between the two. As a storytelling element, it is compelling to follow an emotionally darker character, especially in a horror game. After all, a horror game's job is to make the player uncomfortable to some degree, and the game did succeed in that department. I'm just not keen on stories where the main character never really evolves past what they were, especially for a story where mental health is the main focus. The final, but admittedly very dumb, nitpick I have with the story is the murders themselves. You want to tell me with a straight face that Simon got Sophie into the bathtub on his own? That he killed Dr. Purnell and managed to escape their office in his wheelchair? He likely shot them with the same pistol he'd ultimately use on himself in All the Bad Ending. So you mean to tell me no one heard a single gunshot? Now, with Sophie, we could give some grace and assume he killed her right before killing himself, but I can't give the doctor's murder any such grace. It seems silly that he would have gotten away from the murder scene. It just makes that part of the ending hard for me to take seriously. And this is what got me playing the game for myself to begin with. I had never played it before myself, having only vicariously experienced it through the horde of Let's Plays on YouTube. The game was an indie darling for a few reasons. It was a free mod to Half-Life, so if you had that, you could play it for no extra cost. And even then, once it got an official release on Steam, players no longer even needed to have Half-Life in order to play it. Another reason would be that there was no other games like it. The closest I could think of story-wise is the Cat Lady as far as having a severely depressed protag fighting monsters goes. And Cry of Fear was a novelty in the horror game landscape of the 2010s. It also released at the peak of creepypasta's first boom in popularity online, having many of the same vibes and visuals as those stories. While I dislike its story now, nor think Simon is the best vehicle for it, it did also raise awareness for mental health and how deep a destructive spiral those afflicted with depression can fall into, and that's nothing to sniff at. There's also the fact that the game is made on metaphors, inviting players to pick at the story and Simon to the point that deep dives were, and still are, being made on them. The game resonates with folks to this day. And maybe it's just due to being in a different point in my life now that I feel out of resonance with the game. As mentioned before, I rage quit because I just got so frustrated with the game. Having only watched Let's Plays prior, I must have only remembered the portions that I liked and not the difficulties players faced with the game. I even had someone pop in stream warning me that I wasn't even at the worst parts of the game yet, gameplay-wise. And that's not really a vote of confidence. My nostalgia for the story wasn't enough to carry me through to the end, and I feel equal parts awe and concern for players whose stubbornness got them through this game. However, nostalgia can blind people to what is actually in front of them, especially for things they liked when they were younger. The reason I feel the need to harp on nostalgia is due to someone that popped in on my stream. They were saying I needed to take it easy on the devs because it was a free project and that they were amateurs. And both of those reasons are bullshit for 3 reasons. Reason 1. Even free games aren't totally free. They still cost time to play. A game should be worth the time you play it, either through its gameplay or story. Ideally both. Given my grievances, for me it wasn't worth it either way. Reason 2. Being an amateur doesn't excuse you from putting out a subpar product. Only being a beginner does. Teams like Scholar put out Afraid of Monsters before this project, then its director's cut, then Cry of Fear, and then finally the Steam release. That's still working on those projects for an extended period of time, long enough that they were amateurs but not beginners anymore. To me, there's no excuse. Which does lead me to reason 3. They've had ample time to update it and make it better. So far, the only update I see for the Steam release was to add a gun and fix a few minor bugs 5 years ago. Nothing before or since then. For a dev that seems so proud of their work, they haven't really done anything with it for the last 10 years. From what I found looking around online, they basically stopped all game dev to playing in a band. Which, no shame in that. I do get you can get tired of working on the same thing or project or hobby, even to the point of leaving it in favor of another. There are murmurings that they're working on a remake and are sharing updates on their server, but I seriously doubt their abilities to make it work since they've supposedly been starting and stopping on that for the same amount of time. For me, personally, the game just doesn't hold up. To quote Ross Scott of Game Dungeon fame, if a game was good in the past, it should still be good now. And holy fuck if it isn't good now. I can handle a lot of jank individually. I can handle it if a game can feel wonky to control and get used to it. I can handle it if the enemies are damage sponges or have bullshit spawns designed to fuck the player over. I can handle a buggy game. I cannot and will not handle a game that does all of the above, as I respect myself and my time a hell of a lot more than that. If you still like the game despite listening to me bitch and complain about it, then good. You're still free to like what you like. It's still, despite my grievances, a classic for a reason. However, this game just wasn't for me. Not anymore. I give thanks for listening this far, and I do genuinely appreciate it. I'd kind of wanted to have a different video to be the first thing I did a more essay-style video/content on, but, you know, here we are.